Have you ever wondered why you have to carry so much extra lead just to stay down at the end of the dive, or call a dive early because your cylinder runs low before everyone else? The wrong cylinder loads you up topside and steals minutes underwater, while the right one trims your weight, carries easier, and lets you finish your dive relaxed. I'm Don, and as an avid diver that has dived all over the world and used many cylinders, in this video I'll show you exactly what to look for: material, valve features, coatings, and capacity families, so you can find the best cylinder for your style of diving. And wherever you are at in your diving journey, I certainly know when I started diving, information on cylinders wasn't necessarily easy for me to come by. And while I've rented and bought cylinders and made plenty of mistakes, I have finally learned everything I feel there is to compile a video that I would have loved to see when I was starting out diving, or even an intermediate diver. And so while someone may not have lied to you, I certainly believe that this information is not always easily accessible. So here it is in one nice, neat little package in the form of a video. Let's dive in. Your cylinder's material is not a spec sheet detail, it's how the dive feels from splash to safety stop, and matters more than you think. And by the way, I am going to use the correct terminology here: cylinder, because there's definitely some individuals who are very particular on this vernacular. Because a cylinder carries gas and a tank carries liquid. It's a small detail, and honestly, I say tank every now and then. I'm sure I've said it in these videos, so it's not that big of a deal. But for this video, we'll make sure you at least know the correct information. And now let's carry on. The common materials come down to steel versus aluminum for scuba cylinders. Steel cylinders stay mostly negative from start to finish, which often lets you remove 1 to 2 kilograms or 2 to 4 pounds and still hover steady at about 5 meters or 20 feet. Aluminum cylinders, on the other hand, start a little negative and finish around plus 1.8 kilogram or plus 4 pounds when near reserve. So they become positively buoyant when they're near empty. And not just a little bit, that's a decent amount. And that is the gentle lift you feel when the stop gets floaty and you find yourself scolding for being too light at the safety stop. In general, you'll want to consider the buoyancy profile of your cylinders and how they will affect you at the start and the end of your dives. They all have little quirks, and it's worth a bit of experimentation. I won't get into all of them in this video, or it'll be way too long, but maybe a future video. But in general, I have a video here that covers a balanced rig, which will help with a little bit of the details that I'm going to stay light on in this one. And it's worth noting that out of the water, steel cylinders will feel much heavier than aluminum too, making entries a bit more difficult. But hey, at least you're getting a better workout trying to get to and from your dive sites, right? For example, a AL80 or 11-liter aluminum full is about 14 kilograms or 31 pounds dry. And a common HP 100 steel or a 12-liter steel full is about 16 kilograms or 35 pounds dry. That's about 2 kg or 4 pounds more. That little extra weight might bother some, but for others, it might be a little bit less weight that you need on your weight belt. Generally, steel's unique properties of being negatively buoyant are most beneficial in cold water, when divers use more weight to offset positive buoyancy. Because their dry suits or thicker wetsuits have so much positive buoyancy, you need to basically strap on a bunch of lead, which gets really tiring really fast, believe me. So that's one nice thing about having that heavier steel cylinder. Not to mention at the end of the dive, it stays negatively buoyant, mostly, which means you need less additional weight on your person, which is quite nice when you're trying to figure out where to fit all that extra lead. Plus, the mass of the cylinder on the back tends to be a nice position for trim. Aluminum, on the other hand, is cheaper, easier to maintain, and generally very popular for rentals across the globe. Where steel is not beneficial, aluminum tends to be favored. Because aluminum is naturally more resistant to rust than steel, it generally means cylinders are easier to upkeep over time. Since steel cylinders have a rust issue, there are some common methods used to try and prevent rust we should discuss. There is the hot dip galvanized steel, which tends to shrug off boat rack scrapes and deck life better than paint. Let's face it, we divers can be pretty rough with our cylinders, and we want this coating to last. Painted or epoxy coated steel looks sharp when new, but once chipped, rust gets a head start under that coating. If you're looking for low maintenance and longevity, you may prefer the galvanized. If you like the look of paint to ensure it matches your dive bling, inspect chips and edges before you pay, and plan to baby the finish. Once it chips, the steel under it may start to corrode. While on the other hand, aluminum resists deep corrosion by default, but still benefits from clean storage and rinses. And many models have a flat base that stands boot free. And so that flat base is a practical detail if you hate trapping sand or salt under the boot. In fact, you can just remove the boot completely. You don't really need a boot on an aluminum cylinder. While if you try and remove the boot on a steel cylinder, you'll find often they're very round on the bottom, which will be annoying for anyone who wants to try and stand it upright. But of course, you can remove the boot on a steel, and you can just get in the habit of always laying your cylinder down because you can stand it up. Factor that boot into how you rinse, dry, and store the cylinder between dives. Also, another factor of diving cylinders is about fit as much as volume. The standard diameter for cylinders is about 7.25 inches or 18.5 inches. Big capacity bodies are 8 inches or 20 centimeters. And they sit differently against your body, and that's something to factor in. They can be a bit harder to manage because of their increased width and potentially weight. And it's worth noting that shorter bodied cylinders suit shorter torsos and short entries, and are generally lighter than other cylinders. So those could increase your accessibility options over the heavier and longer cylinders. While longer bodied cylinders can ride higher for trim, but may also stick that first stage right against the back of your head. So that could be annoying if that's happening to you. But of course, it can come down to maybe just have to position your cylinder a little bit lower. So if you want your gear to feel natural to your diving, instead of a giant boulder strapped to you, pick the material and form factor that matches your suit, your body, and your usual dive sites. And by the way, in this video, I am of course using my own cylinders or maybe my buddy's cylinders, and I'm not trying to advocate these are the cylinders that you should buy. I'm trying to give you the pros and the cons of different styles and types of cylinders so that you can better form the knowledge of what is going to be perfect for you. And I'm hoping this information is mostly timeless to help you keep an informed choice. Next up, let's talk about the cylinder valve, the small part with big consequences. Valves are the connection between your cylinder and your regulator, and surprisingly are more complex than you'd think. I won't go into depth on din versus yoke here, as I recently made a video to cover that in detail, and you can watch that here or maybe over here, somewhere up there. But if you're looking at older cylinders and find a K valve, those are used in yoke regulators, which have a single outlet and are friendly to 232 bar or 3,365 psi. Most cylinders you buy today generally run with a nifty Pro valve, which is a DIN/K valve convertible and works with all regulators and supports up to 232 bar or 3,365 psi. And mostly rounded to 200 bar or 3000 psi. The valves will have an insert in them. That insert makes it compatible with yoke, and when it is taken out, now it's DIN. Just make sure not to lose the insert unless you truly don't need yoke ever. And lastly, we have the regular standard DIN valves, which support up to 232 bar or 3,365 psi. Or even high pressure DIN valves that support up to 300 bar or 4,351 psi. Do note that yoke cannot do high pressure, only DIN. So with DIN valves, you get all the benefits of DIN, which is a newer standard in yoke, but it's not so good that you need to go out and buy it immediately. Plus, if you get the high pressure valve with extra threads, you can have extra capacity fills. But before you go get a high pressure valve and cylinder, make sure you double check where you are to make sure that they can fill to support a high pressure fill, because not every single dive shop will be able to do a high pressure fill. Otherwise, you'll just be disappointed with this potential benefit. In general, I'd recommend the Pro Valve for most. And if you're going for high pressure and your local shop supports high pressure fills, then go in for the extra threaded DIN high pressure connection. And then there's another valve type called the H valve. And this is generally done for single cylinders, which have 2 outlets on one neck. And I don't have one to show you, but you can generally see it because it has the 2 outlets for 2 different regulators to plug in. And I personally don't see these very often. They are a bit niche, but I want you to be able to identify them and know about them. The idea is they give you a bit of redundancy, as you can now have 2 regulators attached to your single cylinder without going double back mounts or double side mounts. The H valve is a little bit heavier, a little bit pricier, and requires a bit of practice, as now you'll have 2 knobs on your single cylinder. Generally, most divers will move on to double back mounts or double side mounts, as they will give you the same benefits of 2 regulators with an extra cylinder of gas. But this might not be viable for everyone, so the H valve is there as a potential option for specialized cases. Next, let's quickly touch on the post of the valve, which changes how you grab your cylinder. Most valve posts are regular or standard, which has the on and off knob on one side and nothing on the other side. Which I will say, the general side that your post or your on-off valve should be is over your right shoulder, so you can grab it with your left arm. You will find left and right posts for side mounts potentially, or double back mounts. But generally for a single cylinder, you want it over your right shoulder. And of course, it's mainly there to make sure that you know where to turn on and off your valve if you need it. Yes, you can turn on and off your valve. And next time you're fully kitted up, try and practice doing that. It could save your life someday. Or at least if you made it through your pre-dive checks, you can turn on your own cylinder when you find out that it's off. It's a good skill to have, but I will say it's harder than you think. So that's the standard valve, but then let's also talk about modular valve posts, which instead have a longer extension on the other side of the knob. These are generally a touch heavier and slightly more expensive, but open doors for use of doubles and side mounts. They're usually easier to grab as well. Not everyone needs to go buy modular valves. In fact, you can still make use of standard valves, but modular valves are mainly beneficial for side mounts and generally make it easier to carry a cylinder over long distances if you're carrying it Farmer John style, which is basically off to your sides and by the neck. And as mentioned, of course, the modular style is generally the one that comes with the left and right variations. Although you can find standard and left and right variations too, maybe for accessibility reasons, you can't grab over your right shoulder, so maybe you can get another valve type that points over the other shoulder, and maybe you can have better reach and flexibility to grab it over your left shoulder. It's not standard, but for accessibility reasons, it might be the best way that you can turn on and off your own cylinder. And modular valves are generally straight at the neck, while non-modular valves can sometimes have a bend at the neck. And this might be beneficial if you find that where your cylinder is sitting, your regulator is often hitting the back of your head. There's a solution for that. And you can buy a standard neck that has a kink that pulls the regulator away from your head and basically sits it away so that you can pull your head back and not bang your regulator. And so that could be beneficial if that's happening to you often. And lastly here, let's take a look at the on-off handwheel valve. The design is not a decoration, it's usability. Big textured handwheels are glove friendly, easy to see, and confidence boosting doing drills or under real emergency in the water with cold gloves on. Tiny slick knobs look tiny but get slippery when you're cold or rushed. So make sure you grab that on and off wheel and just take some time to spin it and see how easy it grabs, because in a real emergency you just want something that's going to feel smooth and feel right turning it on and off. That stem action changes how the valve feels under stress. And also get a feel for how many turns it takes for you to turn on and off your valve, because you'll be doing it a lot. And especially for those who have redundant gas cylinders, meaning 2 cylinders, you'll have to do valve drills, which are turning it on and off and making sure you're breathing off of the other one and switching the right regulator to compensate for it. And so it might be beneficial for some, and this is a big asterisk, that you might want a short throw stem, which opens in fewer turns and feel a lot more decisive for turning off and on your valve. But now, back to asterisk. It is also more dangerous, especially for new divers or even experienced divers, as the rubbing of any kind could potentially turn off your wheel. Because it's a short throw wheel, it's quick to turn on and off, and so if it's rubbing against something, it might turn off while you're breathing from it at depth, in which you would want to be extremely comfortable checking your valves and turning them on and be able to react to that very fast. If you're not, maybe a short throw valve isn't for you. However, they do exist and I want you to be aware of them. And the standard stem is multi-turn, so it's more resistant to bump closures in contact heavy diving and give finer control while you're turning it. And then sometimes you'll see indicator colors on the valve, which basically shows red if off and green if all the way on. And it can be like, if you see both red and green, it's probably not all the way on. Now just consider this as a nice to have, not a must, but a nice to have. Because you can use that indicator, that visual indicator, as a cue, but not a guarantee. Red or green or marked positions help buddies spot a problem during buddy checks visually and much easier, but should not be relied on. They are nice to have. Treat them like seatbelts for your pre-dive check, not parachutes. And of course, I have to mention thread standards and region are the unsexy deal breakers of your valves. The North American threads are generally 3/4 or 14 NPSM neck threads for the valve to screw into the cylinder neck, while most of Europe uses M25/2 to screw into the cylinder neck. So the important takeaway is, if you're in Europe, you want to make sure you have the valve that can screw into your type of cylinder, and vice versa for US. Or if you're using an imperial cylinder rather. So match the valve that you're buying with the neck of your cylinder, or you'll basically have some incompatible valve and cylinder. You won't be able to screw it in. So ultimately, there are a lot of valve options here, and there is no one size fits all. Various pros and cons between the choices, and depending on where you are in your dive journey and what you'll be diving regularly, you may gravitate to one direction or another. Different designs suit different divers. Keep that in mind. That's the theme of this video. And if you're enjoying this video, now is a great time to like and subscribe. It helps this video get seen by other divers, and I personally very appreciate it. I post weekly content to help divers grow their skills, build confidence, and explore the ocean with curiosity and care. And by the way, I have a free monthly newsletter that you're free to subscribe for and unsubscribe at any time if you are looking to keep on the latest and greatest of the scuba industry. Check it out in the description. Now, let's move on to other various details that likely no one ever told you before. Next, we'll look at smaller details of the cylinder that are often missed and might save you years of headaches. Let's take a little bit stronger look at cylinder boots once more. Again, for aluminum, you can just remove those things immediately. No problem. But for steel, you're a bit more committed. So, what good is a boot that doesn't keep the cylinder upright? I, for one, have cylinders with different boots, and I can say there is a better boot for cylinders. Some are flat on the bottom, which is good while it's upright, while others have these interesting decisions and grooves in them, and those make a little bit more wobbly surface. In fact, I hate them, and I'm probably going to eventually get flat boots for them. But ideally, you want your boots to kind of give a good stability for your cylinder. So if you're looking at a good boot, I would just move the head of the cylinder kind of round and see how stable your boot is. Because obviously, if you can find that you're tipping it and it's just kind of instantly going to cave over, I mean, don't let it fall. You can feel how much stability that boot is giving you as you're turning your cylinder. This is mostly important for those who are going to be doing shore diving, where you might be needing to put the cylinder on sand or maybe cement that's not super even. And you'll find that if it has these interesting grooves, these different design choices, it's not super stable. If it's just slightly imbalanced, your cylinder is going to topple over. And so you can't really depend on it for anything at all. So it's just like a very useless boot, in which maybe it's just better to take that thing off, so you just force yourself, okay, I can't keep it upright anymore. Or you can buy another boot. But something to consider when you're trying to buy your own cylinders. And certainly, if you are going to stick with a slightly unstable boot, don't trust that thing worth anything. And so always keep a hand on it. Or if you're going to take a step away, lay your cylinder down flat. That's generally a good idea, even with a good boot, but especially with a bad boot, because you just never know what could potentially knock it over. And keep in mind, your expensive regulator's at the top of it, so don't let your regulator break from a hard fall. And while we're talking about boots, you can carefully inspect your boot and see that it has a drain and vent slot, so salt water doesn't sit and basically corrode the base of your cylinder. And back to aluminum real fast is some other benefits of running boot free is that it dries fast, it collects less grit, and you can always add a removable boot for the slippery decks, which may offer some peace of mind. But generally, aluminum does quite well without a boot. All right, next we'll talk about two important identifiers that are going to be on your cylinder. And they're more than just advertisements for your local dive shop. This is especially important for maintenance and buying used cylinders especially. Along the neck is going to have a bunch of important information, like the working pressure in bar or PSI, the standard code like DOT, TC, or EN, and the hydro month and year, the serial, and the material. These are all standard and usually stamped right into the steel, so you can't just rub it off without rubbing the steel off. They're usually in there, so look at the base, and depending on how many times your cylinder has been hydroed, which generally requires a hydro test every 5 years, you can kind of see how old the cylinder is as well. Generally, one stamp for every 5 years, so you can count how old the cylinder is roughly. And I won't say an old cylinder is necessarily bad, but what is important is your cylinder is not out of hydro, meaning that it could be unsafe. And what a hydro is basically putting very high pressure into your cylinder and seeing and making sure it doesn't warp and potentially explode. It's testing the structural integrity of your cylinder. And so as long as it's within its hydro and it's stamped in there and not expired more than 5 years from the last hydro, then it's generally pretty safe. I've definitely heard stories of some people using their cylinders for 40 plus years. So as long as you baby your cylinder, it can last quite a long time. Lower on the cylinder, usually along the middle or even the bottom of the cylinder, is a sticker that shows the annual visual inspection was done and when you should redo it. Remember, it's annual, so once a year. And those are usually rocking your local cool designs from the local dive shops that you generally dive with. Support those dive shops. Then there is this little hole at the back of the cylinder neck. It's called the burst disc. It's there to ensure that if your cylinder is superheated, like in your car, in the sun, the gas will expand in the cylinder, and instead of causing a potential explosion of the cylinder, will instead burst that foiled disc inside and allow for emergency release of the air. The burst disc is a one-time failsafe, so if it breaks, it has to be replaced. So also be sure to inspect that this thing is intact on used cylinders. There are popular cave fills in some regions that overfill cylinders regularly and can stress the burst disc, which leads to potentially blowing underwater. And I have heard stories of people just putting a screw in there or putting something in there to just basically override the failsafe that the burst disc would basically provide. So if you are buying used, make sure that burst disc is in that hole, because in the event that it bursts, it should pop out of the hole and allow the air to release from the neck. And it is a proper burst disc and not some kind of screw jammed in there. For recreational divers, this isn't really needed. For tech divers, and another small detail that is important, but not necessarily for recreational divers, But for tech divers who are going to potentially be using cylinders for more than 40% oxygen, it's important to recognize that your cylinder, the inside of it, and including the valve, needs to be oxygen cleaned, 100% oxygen cleaned. Basically, including your regulator, everything that's going to touch the gas must be oxygen clean from the valves, O-rings, lubricant, and inside the cylinder. But if you're going to be using 40% or less for most recreational dives, then you don't need it to be oxygen clean. So just when you see oxygen clean, or rather 100% oxygen clean, just recognize what that is, and you probably don't need it unless you're going to need more than 40%. But if you're a recreational diver thinking of potentially doing tech dives and you want a potentially oxygen ready setup, maybe you see it used or whatever the case have you, you could buy an oxygen clean gas cylinder. And as long as your shop uses membrane nitrox under 40% oxygen, you can still buy oxygen ready and keep the future options open. So you won't potentially dirty your oxygen clean cylinder as long as you're using oxygen clean, or rather membrane air or nitrox. But if it's not that, then it's important to note that you add that in your cylinder, then it's no longer oxygen cleaned, which could be a big bummer because it's not always cheap to keep it oxygen clean. So it's good to know if a cylinder is oxygen clean, keep it oxygen clean. Now, let's talk about the last critical piece you'll need to consider for your cylinder, and it's an important one, the capacity. The normal thing we think of cylinders is how much gas it can fit in. So it's an important thing, but let's skip getting deep in the weeds with capacity of the cylinder. But I will do my best to convert metric and imperial here so everyone can follow. There are so many types of cylinders and capacities that I could probably make this like a 2-hour video. So I'm going to group a bunch of various cylinders into families and approximations so you can get an idea of best use cases for different capacity cylinders. It's not always about getting more gas for your dive. First, let's talk about the most common aluminum cylinders that you would use for primary bottom gas cylinders. All aluminum sits at service fills at 207 bar or 3000 psi. There's no high pressure aluminum, at least not that I'm aware of. First up, let's talk about the AL63 or the aluminum 9 liter. These are shorter, lighter, kind to ladders, and great for mellow, shallow days or smaller divers. Then there are the AL80s or the 12 liter, which is the staple fleet of most diving cylinders. It's the worldwide rental standard for warm water with familiar buoyancy and instant compatibility anywhere you fly. Your staple dive cylinder, really. And lastly, for aluminum, we have the AL100 or the 15 liter, where those who are not great with gas consumption or seeking extra long dives can seek out these bigger and fatter cylinders to help offset with raw capacity. And by the way, by high pressure, I meant not in the same way as steel cylinders, but there is such a tiny little designation with aluminum cylinders that is less significant than steel cylinders, but it's still important to note that some have a little designation with a C or an S, and you can usually find this information on the cylinder neck. And so the C generally stands for high pressure and the S stands for normal pressure. The C designates that aluminum cylinders can generally hold a little bit more pressure when we're talking about 300 psi or 20 bar. Not that much more, but it can make a small difference. So if you are looking for that, it's important to know that that's the designation. Next, let's talk about the bigger and more wider variety of cylinders, the steel cylinders. All of these have a surface pressure of 232 bar to 237 bar or 3,365 bar to 3,442 bar. But of course, there's also high pressure variants of steel cylinders. And so high pressure, as long as the valve is high pressure and the cylinder is high pressure, then you can have up to 300 bar or 4,000 psi. So that's one nice benefit of a high pressure cylinder. But of course, pressure doesn't always mean more gas. And so that's some of the complexity and the nitty gritty of trying to figure out these different cylinders. But that's a whole nother conversation. I'm going to try and give you the high level of all these things, so and generally what they're good for. Let's start with the smaller 11-liter steel, or often marked as HP80 in Imperial. The HP80s are nice because they're a little bit lighter, they're shorter, and they're good for smaller torsos or easy to carry, just like the AL63 I talked about not too long ago. But also they only have 11-liter or 80 cubic feet of gas capacity. Then we have the mainstream 12-liter steel, or often sold as the HP100 in Imperial. This is like the AL80 of steel cylinders. They're very common for steel cylinders, and they are nice, and they have a nice length to them. So for most average height people, the cylinders will trim out those individuals fairly well. And of course, since it's steel, you need a little bit less lead too, which is a nice benefit. Not to mention, it stays mostly negative even when empty. Then of course, there's the Fat Boy, which is the 15-liter steel, often sold as the HP 117. This one will give you the longest single tank run times, the heaviest carry, biggest footprint, but also the happiest gas hogs or those wanting a little bit longer dives. And so for both aluminums and steels, I went ahead and categorized them to the most common small cylinders, the normal standard cylinders, and then the common high capacity cylinders. But there are bigger and even odder cylinders out there by different manufacturers, different niches, different diameters, different labeling, but they're mostly less mainstream. Still, we could be talking about that kind of gas capacity and small little details and make this video way longer than it needs to be. So I'm trying to simplify these a little bit. And of course, to make things a little bit more complicated, for steel, we have common low pressure variants to consider. But first, let's talk about what low pressure means. Outside of the US, cylinders usually don't have high or low pressure ratings, so this is more of an imperial thing. But different cylinders with low pressure will generally fill up to 2,400 to 2,800 psi. Its intended fill rating is usually stamped on the cylinder neck, so make sure you look at that. The amount of pressure doesn't mean capacity for Imperial though. It simply means you need less pressure to hit max capacity. So if you have a low pressure 85, it means it holds 85 cubic feet of gas at its maximum low pressure fill rate of, let's say, 2,600 psi, which is lower than 3,000. So if you're using a low pressure cylinder and you take it to the shop and they only fill it to 2,600, you haven't been ripped off. It's the max capacity of your cylinder, but it still has 85 cubic feet in it, so that's not too bad. It gets a little confusing, to be honest. But the number to remember with Imperial cylinders is the end number, like 80, 85, 90, or 100. That's capacity. The low versus high pressure is what pressure it is needing to hit that capacity. And so it doesn't matter too much. It just makes maybe division a little bit harder, like when I'm at 1/3 or 2/3 cylinder, you just have to make sure you're not using a 3,000 cylinder calculation. You'll just have to make sure you do the math correctly for the pressure of your working pressure of your tank. Now, one word of caution here is it's entirely a thing for divers with low pressure cylinders to fill above their intended pressure on purpose or accidentally, as many operators fill or treat every cylinder like they're going to fill to 3,000 or potentially even overfill to 3,400, which is fine for a regular high pressure cylinder. But for a low pressure cylinder, that's 800 psi more than its intended maximum fill rate at around, if the fill rate's normally 2,600 psi. And they might just do that without thinking, because usually at the fill stations, they'll set it to a number and just fill every single cylinder to that. And so it's very important to let the operator know that it's a low pressure, or a better option is to take a electrical tape or some tape on there that you can permanently have, put it at the neck of the cylinder right where it's going to be filled, and mark it as LP, or low pressure. Make sure you put those words on there, and that will tell the operator, okay, it's low pressure. So they'll probably check what the max pressure is from there and make sure they fill it appropriately. Otherwise, they might just Especially if they're being rushed, just fill it to the same fill rate that they treat every single other cylinders, especially if they don't recognize the type of cylinder. Because remember, when you overfill the thing, especially when it's getting a little hot, you're going to be putting pressure on that burst disc, which might damage your burst disc, making it more volatile to burst potentially underwater. If you're intending to get a higher fill in your cylinders, that's fine. I'm not going to judge you here. But make sure you are well comfortable with dealing with potential cylinder failure if that is the case. And one more thing on high versus low pressure cylinder attributes is also high pressure tends to be a bit lighter and more compact, while low pressure tends to be heavier, which make them a bit nicer characteristic for cold water diving as you need less lead elsewhere. Okay, now that we've established that, let's talk about those low pressure cylinders, starting with LP85 steel or 13 liter that has a service pressure of 182 bar or 2,640 psi. These low pressure variants tend to be very nice for doubles and side mounts, especially since they have nice buoyancy characteristics for cold water. And there's also LP80s as well that are quite common. So it's either going to be LP80s or LP85s that are kind of like the norm for low pressure cylinders. And of course, there's many taller and fatter low pressure cylinders as you bump it up to higher capacity cylinders as well. Now, you might be wondering, I mentioned these are all great cylinders for bottom gas that you'll use on most, if not all of your dives. But which one is for you? I'd say both aluminum and steel with HB 100s or AL 80s or 12 liters are your mainstays. They're your common and good baseline for most diving. But of course, if these cylinders are too long or too heavy for you and you're okay with your gas consumption, meaning you have enough to keep up with all of your buddies on your team, then you could consider the smaller, shorter cylinder variants as I mentioned, the AL63s or the HP80s. If you're seeking a ton of gas and are strong enough to wield a heavy and unwieldy cylinder, explore the fatter and bigger variants as I mentioned. There's a lot of them. Of course, this is a bit of a hand-wavy answer, but I do hope it helps give a general idea for the use cases and helps you understand where you should lean. There are so many other odd-shaped cylinders that are less standard, and those cylinders are mostly for bottom gas, or rather the gas you're going to use during your bottom time for most of your diving. There are many other odd-shaped cylinders that are less standard, especially for recreational divers. But I want you to be aware of these regardless, as they're more niche for technical divers or other niche cases. These tend to be for stage, pony, or deco bottles. These names are often used as synonyms, but their meaning is subtle. Pony bottle is a small cylinder that you keep with you as a backup in case your main gas cylinder fails, meaning the regulator's busted on it or maybe O-ring pops, something's gone wrong and you're losing gas out of it. No problem. You can fail over to your pony bottle, which has its own regulator, and abort the dive safely. Usually pony bottles are very small. They're enough to basically end the dive at your deepest depth and go straight to the surface with enough air to get you there safely. A stage cylinder is a staged medium to large cylinder that you stage somewhere and switch to extend your bottom time. And this could be hanging from a boat or put somewhere that you would switch to and basically extend that bottom gas time. So you basically would switch one out for the other for your bottom gas. And then there's also the decompression cylinder, which is a medium to large cylinder and you use when you're ascending, or rather decompressing, or doing a required decompression, or rather doing required decompression procedure because you now have a virtual ceiling. You've gone past your NDL and have that virtual ceiling, so you can't ascend to the surface. You go to your virtual ceiling and wait until you've decompressed enough that you can ascend further. And so decompression cylinders generally have a higher oxygen percentage so that you can decompress faster. And so generally, deco cylinders are those cylinders that you'll need to have oxygen clean because generally they will have more than 40% oxygen in them. But you can still have less than 40%. So it just depends on your dive plan, your gas plan, and what you're doing with your diving. Most of these cylinders are all going to have a surface pressure of 207 bar or 3000 psi. That's pretty standard. They're also almost always aluminum as well, because generally these are additive bottles, and aluminum bottles just have a little bit lighter negative buoyancy properties. Like steel tanks are heavy, so they're going to be negatively buoyant, and so you'll have aluminum tanks that will be a lot less negatively buoyant. You don't want to have a whole bunch of negative buoyancy, especially when you're basically having a whole bunch of cylinders on you, because we want to keep a balanced rig, at least as much as possible. So let's look at various sizes you might use for these purposes. These are companions that pair with your primary cylinders, your primary bottom cylinders. First, let's talk about the tiny AL19 or 3 liter, which is a cylinder that makes for a tiny bailout bottle, or rather a pony bottle. And it's there to be light, unobtrusive, and there as a backup in case your main cylinder basically breaks. It's not going to have a lot of air, so it's basically just enough to get you to the surface. And it's definitely only enough for recreational diving. Generally, most divers won't use bailout bottles, but they're more niche for potentially solo divers for that a little bit extra self-resilience in case one cylinder breaks. You don't have a buddy to give you air, so that's when you would use a pony bottle. Then there's the AL40 or 5.5 liter, which serves for clean rigging for rich nitrox or decompression gas with predictable buoyancy characteristics. And these are generally used for decompression gases that are 50% or above, mostly tech divers. You could potentially use it as a bit bigger pony or bailout bottle as well. And then there's the AL72 or AL80s or 10 liter or 12 liters, all aluminum, that give a much larger capacity of gas. And these can generally be used as stage cylinders or decompression gases. And what's nice is they generally are near neutral, although they do turn slightly positive as they're getting empty, but generally handling them stays predictable. And again, they make good for extending that bottom time as a stage cylinder, either on you or staged somewhere, or potentially as a nice bottom gas timer for when you have a lot of decompression procedure, like a lot of time. We're talking, extensive amount of time. And so it gives you options of being able to decompress over that time and generally get to a higher ceiling so that you could potentially use your smaller 40 liter. So you can potentially switch to your smaller cylinder that you can decompress a little bit faster at a more shallow depth. And again, aluminum is standard choice for bailout, deco, and stage cylinders for their lighter characteristics and handling in cold or warm water. So that's the bulk of the families in my book. There are, of course, many more different brands, different sizes, different brands, and there's all sorts of, nitty and gritty detail that I'm glossing over. But I wanted to help paint the broad strokes here. There is no prize for suffering with the wrong cylinder. So I hope this armed you with the baseline knowledge to make your purchase or rental armed and ready. There's certainly a lot of joy in picking the right setup and basically removing all those distractions and letting the dive take center stage, because that's what we're all here for, enjoying diving. Don't let your cylinder take that away from you. Ultimately, your cylinder choice shows up as calmer stops, cleaner trim, and less deck drama. Pick features that match how you actually dive and let the gear disappear so the dive shines. Earlier, I glossed over din versus yoke, which we might want a little bit more detail on. So if you're interested, check that out here next. But if you're looking for a video similar to this one that talks more about regulators, you might be interested in this one here. Check out either one that suits your fancy. The more you know, the more you'll love and protect the ocean. Until next time.